It has not stopped raining in 11 days. The river that fed your camp is now a brown flood eating the tree line. The berries are gone. The animals have moved somewhere you cannot follow. Your fire keeps drowning under the drip from the shelter roof. And somewhere behind you, a child is coughing in a way that scares you more than any predator ever has. This is not a bad week. This is a bad decade. Somewhere on this planet, for thousands of years at a time, the sky simply refused to cooperate, and an entire way of life had to be rebuilt around that fact. Stick around, because this one gets strange fast. And if you like stories about how humans refuse to just lie down and die, go ahead and subscribe before we start, because this channel is basically built for you. Let's get one thing straight first. Bad weather to us means a canceled flight or a soaked pair of shoes. Bad weather to ancient humans could mean generations. Not a storm, not a season, but a climate shift that lasted longer than anyone alive had ever known anything else. And the evidence for just how bad it got is written directly into ice, rock, and bone. Around 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano called Toba erupted in what is now Indonesia. It was one of the largest eruptions in the last 2 million years. Ash spread across South Asia in a layer several inches thick. Sulfur particles shot into the upper atmosphere and stayed there, blocking sunlight for years. Some researchers believe global temperatures dropped enough to trigger what is sometimes called a volcanic winter, a stretch of cold, dim, unpredictable seasons that could have lasted the better part of a decade. Genetic studies have found signs of a population bottleneck around this period, a moment where human numbers may have dropped low enough that the entire species came uncomfortably close to disappearing. Whether Toba alone caused it is still debated. But the timing is hard to ignore, and it tells you something important. Weather was never just weather, it was survival math, and sometimes the math turned against us. Now zoom forward to the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, at the coldest point scientists call the last glacial maximum. Ice sheets over a mile thick covered huge portions of North America and Europe. Sea levels dropped so far that land bridges opened between continents. But here is the part people forget. It was not just cold, it was dry. Ice ages lock enormous amounts of water into glaciers, which starves the rest of the planet of rainfall. Vast regions that once supported forests and grasslands turned into cold deserts. Dust storms swept across Europe and Asia so consistently that thick layers of wind-blown sediment, called loess, are still found stacked meters deep in places like China and Ukraine. Imagine trying to hunt, gather, or even just breathe in a world where the wind never really stopped carrying grit. So, what did people actually do when the bad weather refused to end? The first answer is the most obvious one, and it is the one every version of this story keeps coming back to. Shelter got serious. In the open, treeless plains of Ice Age Ukraine and Russia, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of huts built almost entirely from mammoth bones. Not wood, because there was barely any wood left to use. Massive skulls and leg bones were stacked and arranged into circular foundations, sometimes using dozens of animals' worth of material, then likely covered with hides. Building one of these structures took planning, cooperation, and serious physical effort. This was not a quick shelter thrown up before nightfall. This was closer to construction, a direct response to a climate that gave you no other option. Clothing changed too, and this is where it gets genuinely clever. Around 40 to 45,000 years ago, bone and ivory sewing needles start appearing in the archaeological record, with eye holes fine enough to thread with a sinew. That single tool changed everything. A needle means you are not just draping a hide over your shoulders. You are tailoring it. Fitted clothing traps body heat far more effectively than loose wraps, and some researchers argue that this technology may have given certain human groups a real survival edge during the coldest, harshest stretches of the Ice Age. Genetic evidence even suggests the body lice, which lives specifically in clothing rather than hair, trace back to roughly this same window of time. In other words, we can actually date the invention of real clothing partly by tracking the parasites that evolved to live in it. Food storage became a matter of life and death rather than convenience. When a bad season could stretch into bad years, you could not simply wait for things to improve. Evidence from multiple Ice Age sites shows deliberate drying and smoking of meat, and in colder regions, natural freezing was used almost like a built-in refrigerator, with caches dug into permafrost or packed with snow. Some groups appear to have stored fat reserves specifically for lean months, a kind of prehistoric pantry planning. This required something huge, something easy to overlook. It required thinking in advance about a future that had not happened yet, planning not for tomorrow, but for a winter that might not end when it was supposed to. Fire again was central, but during prolonged bad weather, it became something closer to a full-time job. Keeping a flame alive through weeks of rain, wind, and cold meant someone had to tend it constantly, protect the fuel supply, and know how to relight it fast if it went out. Some archaeological sites show fire being maintained in the same hearth locations for generations, which tells us that fire management was not just a skill, it was inherited knowledge, passed down specifically because losing it could be fatal. But the physical solutions only tell half the story, and honestly, they might not even be the most important half. When bad weather trapped groups together for long stretches, unable to travel far, unable to hunt normally, something had to fill that time and hold the group together. Social bonds mattered more than ever. Isolation during a normal week is uncomfortable. Isolation during a multi-year cold snap could be fatal, because no single family could store enough food or maintain enough shelter alone. Groups appear to have widened their social networks specifically as insurance against bad seasons, trading not just goods but relationships across long distances. If your local area failed you, you needed somewhere else to go, and someone willing to take you in when you got there. Archaeologists have traced raw materials like specific types of stone or shell ornaments moving hundreds of kilometers from their source, which suggests trade and alliance networks stretching far beyond a single camp. That network was not just about resources, it was a weather insurance policy built entirely out of relationships. There is also a psychological side to this that rarely gets discussed. Long stretches of bad weather mean long stretches of being stuck inside in the dark, with very little to do but talk. Some researchers who study foraging societies have pointed out that storytelling, myth, and ritual tend to intensify during exactly these kinds of periods, when physical activity is limited and people need something to hold their attention and their nerves together. A group that can tell itself a coherent story about why the world has turned against it, and why things will eventually turn back, may simply cope better than a group sitting in silence, watching the rain and wondering if it will ever stop. Belief systems built around seasons, cycles, and returning light may have started here in exactly these long, miserable stretches as a way of turning an unbearable present into something with a shape and an end point. And when local solutions ran out entirely, people moved. Migration during climate downturns was not one dramatic exodus, but a slow, repeated pattern happening across the species over tens of thousands of years. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that as certain regions became unlivable, populations pulled back into what researchers now call refugia, pockets of land where conditions stayed survivable even while everything around them deteriorated. Parts of southern Europe, sheltered valleys in Africa, and certain coastal regions appear to have functioned this way during the harshest Ice Age stretches. When conditions improved, people spread back out from these pockets, which is part of why certain regions show such deep, continuous signs of human occupation across incredibly long time spans. In a sense, these refugia were humanity's backup save file, the place the species kept surviving from even when the rest of the map went dark. There is another example worth mentioning, because it shows just how fast things could turn even after the worst of the Ice Age was supposedly over. Around 12,900 years ago, the climate had already begun warming, ice was retreating, and life should have been getting easier. Then, in what researchers call the Younger Dryas event, temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere plunged back toward glacial conditions in what may have been just a few decades, an alarmingly fast shift by climate standards. Forests that had started regrowing died back. Rivers that had begun flowing again froze or dried. For people who had just started to relax into a warmer, more predictable world, the weather effectively slammed the door shut again for well over 1,000 years. Some researchers have connected this abrupt cold snap to major shifts in how certain groups lived, including a move toward more intensive gathering of wild grains as a hedge against unreliable hunting, a change that some argue helped set the stage for agriculture once the climate finally stabilized. In other words, one of the most consequential turning points in human history may have started as a desperate response to weather that simply refused to behave. Drought presented its own brutal version of this problem, especially in regions without ice or snow to fall back on. Around 4,200 years ago, a prolonged megadrought struck large parts of the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, an event so significant that geologists actually use it to mark the start of a new age on the geologic timescale. Rivers that entire communities depended on shrank for generations. In arid environments like this, the ancient response looked different from the Ice Age playbook. Instead of thick fur clothing and bone huts, survival depended on knowing exactly where hidden water sources were, digging deeper wells, and building the kind of detailed mental maps of a landscape that could mean the difference between finding water and not. Oral knowledge about seasonal water holes passed down and constantly updated across generations functioned as its own kind of technology, just as vital in a drought as a fitted coat was in a blizzard. When rain refused to fall for years at a stretch, memory itself became a survival tool. What is remarkable, looking at all of this together, is that bad weather did not just threaten ancient humans. In a strange way, it shaped them. The pressure of unpredictable, prolonged climate stress appears again and again alongside major leaps in technology and cooperation, tailored clothing, engineered shelter, long-distance trade, planned food storage, and the kind of social glue that lets a group hold together instead of falling apart when things go wrong for a very long time. None of that was inevitable. Plenty of other species faced the same shifting climates and simply vanished. Humans adapted not because any single person was clever enough to solve it alone, but because the group figured out how to solve it together, generation after generation, storm after storm, and passed the answer down before the next bad stretch arrived. So the next time a week of rain ruins your plans, it is worth remembering that somewhere in your ancestry, a group of people once sat inside a hut built from mammoth bones, tending a fire they could not afford to lose, waiting out a winter that refused to end, and figuring out how to make it to the other side. They did not have weather forecasts, they did not have heating systems or stockpiled grocery stores. They had each other, a stubborn refusal to give up, and just enough cleverness to turn a crisis into a new way of living. Every single comfort you take for granted today, from insulated walls to canned food to the simple certainty that tomorrow will not be radically different from today, exists because somewhere back in that long chain of ancestors, Enough people got the answer right often enough for long enough to hand it forward to the next generation. If you found this as unsettling and fascinating as I did, hit subscribe, because this channel is all about digging up the parts of human history that never made it into the textbooks. And before you go, I want to know what you think. If you were dropped into a multi-year cold snap with nothing but the people around you, what do you think would break your group first? The lack of food, the lack of shelter, or the lack of patience with each other? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.